Good morning, everyone. My name is Lacey Villava, and I'm so excited to be bringing to you our Revolutionary War Day program from Gunston Hall. I'm super excited to be joined by members of the team at Jamestown-Yorktown Foundation, just down the road from us. We are joined by Felicia Abrams and members of their interpretive team, who Felicia will introduce a little bit later on in the program. But I'm excited to get us started. So we are interested in looking at supplies during the American Revolution. So I am imagining for any of you out there watching with us, you can remember a moment in American Revolutionary history when the soldiers didn't quite have enough. Maybe, at Valley Forge. So I'm going to turn it over to Felicia, Stephen Phillips, and the interpretive team at Jamestown-Yorktown Foundation to look at what supplies did armies need during the American Revolution, and did they have enough? Felicia.
Oh, thank you, Lacey. How are you today?
Doing well, thanks. How are you guys, Felicia?
We're doing great. It's, beautiful and foggy here in Yorktown, Virginia today. Let's get us started, and we're going to start with a little letter because it's all about the primary sources we have in telling this history. And so we're going to hear from the words of the people who were there today. So in August of 1778, General Washington writes to the president of the Continental Congress, South Carolinian, Henry Lawrence, and he says, "Sir, I take the liberty of transmitting to Congress the enclosed letter, which I just now received from the Paymaster General. They will perceive by it that the military chest is entirely exhausted, and that a third of the army remains unpaid for the months of May and April. The importance and necessity of an immediate and a large supply will once appear, and I am persuaded it will be ordered and forwarded with all possible expedition." So what is he looking at here? What are we missing? He's saying, hey, my soldiers who are fighting all over the place aren't getting paid what they're supposed to. That's just one of the things we're going to take a little bit of look at today. But we're going to start by talking about what you need to recruit soldiers. And for that, I'm going to introduce my colleague, Stephen Phillips. He's going to come on camera as I step away here.
Hi, Stephen. Thanks for joining us.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining me. Talk a little bit about recruitment. George Washington understood very early in the Revolution that he was going to need a professional standing army to win this war. He wasn't going to be able to rely on militias. So recruitment became an ongoing and constant problem. Recruiters would generally show up in your town with a drummer. They would drum up, make a lot of noise, get everybody down to the tavern in the center of town. Best time to recruit was in the winter, after the crops had been harvested and before the spring planting was done. Young men could be enticed to join the military. What were they offered? Well, bounties of land, money, pay, as well as honor, glory, adventure, and maybe they even believed in this whole liberty thing. So what did the army have to promise them? Well, it had to promise they would take care of their food, their clothing, their shelter, and their medical supplies. As we know, that was a very, very difficult task.
All right, so we're going to turn it over now, since we're talking about those supplies, and turn it over to Leanne Shellhorse here, who's going to introduce us to the area we're standing in, what we're looking at, and talk about the supplies for the military.
Well, welcome to the American Revolution Museum at Yorktown. We are here in our recreated Continental Army encampment, and this area that we have set aside here is representing our quartermaster. Now, the quartermaster is someone who would have been put in charge of getting supplies and for quartering the soldiers. In addition to getting supplies, he's also going to be responsible for scouting out camp locations, the routes, marching orders, that type of thing as well. So his duties here go well beyond the supplies that the Army needs. Now, in order to be a quartermaster, you're going to have some connections. You're going to have to understand a little bit about trade. You're going to have some negotiating skills. You're going to have some good credit somewhere. And you could be held responsible for debts that you incurred. So this is a lot of responsibility to put on these quartermaster generals. They are going to go through some reorganizing as the war goes on so that they can become more efficient. because not only do they have to get all these supplies, they have to move these supplies from location to location. So it's quite a big endeavor involving logistics as well. Now, if you're the quartermaster, some of your work is going to overlap another very important position, the commissary general, and that is procuring food. And as we all know, this is something that comes up a lot with Continental Army soldiers, whether they're getting food, whether they're getting the amount of food they're supposed to, and the condition of the food that they're getting. So when you're looking at a soldier's daily rations, it might look something like this. You should be getting about a pound of bread per day. When we talk about bread, we're talking about hard bread. This is wheat flour, salt, water. This is something that's going to be overworked, cooked at a low temperature for a long period of time because we want it to be able to hold up to camp life. It's got to travel in a soldier's haversack, maybe last in barrels for days, weeks, months. To make it edible, they'll throw it into their coffee, their tea, their stew, something to soften it up. It's filler. It's going to kind of turn into like a big coffee.
Dan, can you hold it a little closer to the camera so we can see it a little better?
Yeah, you want to get a nice good look of that delicious hard bread. How's that?
Oh, you froze up on me, but I'm hoping our viewers online can see it. I've worked with hardtack, hard bread, ship's bread, depending on the period, what you want to call it. Yeah, there we go. I can see it now. Sorry, apparently my video is not doing super well today. My connection is a little unstable. Hopefully that'll clear up in just a second, and I'm going to double check my internet connection while Leanne continues.
Yeah, so in addition to that hard bread that would have actually been purchased, so hard bread's not typically something you're going to see made in the camp. They'll purchase the hard bread. They even have a baker general who was a German immigrant by the name of Christopher Ludwig, I do believe, from Philadelphia. Now, your daily vegetable ration is going to be a Jill, which is about a half a cup of dried vegetables per day. You see that we have beans here. It could be beans, peas, rice, lentils, stuff that's going to be dry. You're also going to be getting a pound of salted meat per day. Your protein could be beef, pork, or fish. This happens to be some pork that has been salt cured here on site with our farm folks. You're also going to be getting things like vinegar, coffee, tea, maybe rum, whiskey, ale. Those rum rations are going to be about a Jill, which is about 5 ounces. You could add those to your canteen. So those are some of the other things you might see them getting as well. Now, in addition to the very important food rations that you're going to be getting, you're also going to be relying on the Army for clothing. So you see me wearing my regimental, my West kit, the shirt underneath, the stockings or socks and pants. The clothing that is closest to the body is often referred to as like small clothes. So you should actually get a second set of that. So that would look, something like an extra set of, we would probably call them socks or stockings. So you'll see we have a nice white pair there. Would be nice to have an extra pair of socks, as well as that shirt, which is going to be your entire undergarment. So you should be getting an extra shirt as well. Now, one of the problems that you're going to have, and you'll see we already have this problem here, these shirts are going to get worn out. These pants are going to get worn out, or overalls or coveralls, if you will. The regimental coats are going to get worn out. And it's not always possible to keep an endless supply of new clothing. So they're going to start tasking the soldiers with taking care of this themselves. So they would be instructed to be giving needles for sewing. And you'll see we've got a few stored here. They're not wanting to come out. They're kind of sticky in there. But anyway, you'll see that this is just a little vessel for holding a sewing kit. So you'd have your sewing needles in here. You'll see I've got a little extra thread that I'm hanging on to right out there. They're supposed to be getting white thread and blue thread, but like a lot of things, that's not always possible. But if the soldiers can do some of their own clothes mending, that will help get some longevity out of those clothes and get them through those kind of droughts, if you will, where they're not getting replacement clothing. One of the very other important things that the Army is going to need, and you'll hear this come up a lot in regards to the shelter, they are providing the soldiers with tents, housing 6 men in those 7-foot by 7-foot common tents. Using straw for bedding, but also a very important part of that shelter is the blanket. So these wool blankets should be issued to the soldiers. And you'll see this is a nice, good cozy gray wool blanket for a cold, damp day like today. But there's some problems with the blankets. They're not always getting enough for every soldier, and they're not always getting a blanket that is of good quality, or that is what they consider adequate. One instance in particular that happens around September 6th or 7th of 1776 is Thomas Pickering observes a Captain Armstrong of North Carolina coming in with a wagon of blankets for his soldiers, because states are often required to contribute to the supplies and to provide the supplies. So he comes in and he's got a wagon for these North Carolina soldiers, about 4 wagons in total. So by all accounts, you would think that that is plenty blankets. On further inspection, he discovers that these blankets are very small, and they would have to sew 2 of them together to make a blanket that a soldier could actually use. So then they end up with
no.
again. Another interesting thing that came from that encounter is they decide to do a good return on blankets, get an inventory, if you will. We have a Virginia unit that is reporting a 39% shortage, and Clinton's brigade from New York says 75% of his men have no blankets at all. So this is, early fall that they're talking about. So they're facing going into the winter with these large blanket shortages. So this is something that they're really going to have to work to remedy. The other problem that you're going to have comes from money. The soldiers are promised $6.50 a month in pay, but this is continental money. It's not backed by gold or silver. It's not backed by specie. So this is something that's going to kind of be a problem all throughout the war for everyone. You have a problem with the enlisted men getting paid. In fact, there's a couple of uprisings in camps, if you will, people that are upset because they're not getting paid. But you also have the problem of the quartermaster general not having enough money to procure what he needs for the soldiers. By 79, they're estimating that 30, and of course I only have a couple here, but they're estimating that 30 continental dollars will buy 1 species worth of supplies for the soldiers. So imagine that conversion rate. Yeah, your $30 is not going very far, is it? So this is something that they're going to have to deal with. They're going to have to work almost like on a promissory note system or an IOU system, where they're going to promise payment for goods when the war is over. And this is where you're going to see, a lot of civilians come into play, because who are they going to go to for these supplies? They're relying very heavily on private merchants to supply some of the things that the soldiers are going to be needing. And so what you're going to see is some inflation. You're also going to see a lot of competition. So if the Army is ordered by Continental Congress to supply the troops, but the states are also required to supply the troops, and you have other armies here, like the British Army, the French Army, the Hessians, you've got a lot of people competing for the same goods and going to the same sources for those goods. Another great example of shortages in the camp comes from medicine. The medical department is going to be trying to secure medicines and tools for the Army surgeons to care for the soldiers here in the camp. And one of the things you can imagine would be heavily in demand is something like laudanum. And I like to use laudanum as an example because it first illustrates that they do have something to use for pain management. Not anesthesia. They can't put you in a sleep state, but they have something for pain management. And you can imagine when you have sick and injured soldiers, pain management is going to be very important. But laudanum is what? It's opium. Opium is sourced from the poppy, and those do not grow here. So they're sourcing opium in the 18th century from places like China and Turkey. So when the colonies go to war with the only people they've ever traded with, they now have a bit of a problem. They're not going to be able to get things from these faraway places. And when they do, they're going to be very expensive. So you can see that, not only are logistics a problem, money is a problem. This is a very challenging position, and it's very critical to the success for the Army.
All right, Lacey. Leanne, thank you.
You're welcome.
Yeah,
Have a wonderful day.
thank you so much, Leanne. That was fascinating. And as you mentioned, of course, there are lots of private people who are supporting the Revolutionary Army both the militias and the standing Continental Army. And of course, George Mason here at Gunston Hall was one of them. He provided a lot of goods to the Virginia militia, to the Continental Army. And we're going to take some time now to see if George Mason can help supply the Army at Yorktown with some goods. So we're going to do that by rolling the dice. And here I have a set of dice with all of my different items on it. We're each going to roll our dice. We're going to see if we can match them up and see if I can supply, George Mason here at Gunston Hall can send some supplies to the Army. All right, Felicia, are you ready?
Yes, let's do this.
All right, let's roll those dice.
So we are, Stephen, we are looking for food.
Food. Give you a little Joseph Plum Martin. The men were very much fatigued and faint, having had nothing to eat for 48 hours. At least the greater parts were in this condition, and I among the rest. While standing in the field after the action had ceased, one of the men near the lieutenant colonel complained of being hungry. The colonel, putting his hand into his coat pocket, took out a piece of an ear of Indian corn, burnt black as coal. Here, said he to the man complaining, eat this and be a soldier.
All right, George Mason, can you help these guys out?
Well, we do have the opportunity to maybe provide better grain. So, of course, we're showing the beans, which you guys have seen earlier. But some of these folks could also come through with things like ground corn meal. So when you have like the ground corn, they could actually make a kind of a rough bread, if you will, in the camp. They could make a dough of that cornmeal water and throw those into the cooking fires and make little fire cakes or ash cakes. So even like ground corn would be a nice better alternative to a burnt ear of corn. So yeah, we could come up with things like beans, peas. Down in Georgia, we could even be supplying them with rice. But here in Virginia, a lot of beans.
Great, Lacey.
And
what about
land under the shall be entitled to the same bounting pay and rations as are allowed the officers in the Continental Service. So George Mason is making sure that our militia members are receiving the same amount as what our Continental Army is. All right, shall we roll another dice, Felicia?
another one?
All right, let's see what we can get this time.
We have military supplies.
Oh, we got food.
No.
All right, Stephen, tell us about military supplies from the perspective of the soldiers.
Well, this was actually from General Washington to his brother early in the war, 1775. He says, we are obliged to submit to an almost daily cannonade without returning a shot from our scarcity of powder, which we are necessitated to keep for closer work than cannon distance whenever the redcoat gentry pleases to step out of their entrenchments.
So George Mason, sadly at this moment, cannot provide any military equipment, but he will, if it is thought proper, that Captain Sparks can easily be loaded into Alexandria. I should be glad to know if the Commonwealth wants any further barrels of fine flour. I have 275 barrels of my own, for which I would take $20 or about 14 to 15 hogshead.
So there we're getting that fine meal that Leanne was just talking about here.
Absolutely. So we didn't match up at the right point, but we got some fine meal your direction.
That goes back to logistics and making sure the Army logistics and the supply logistics are working together.
That's right.
Absolutely. And I know that George Mason was very concerned about that during the American Revolution. He writes several letters where he's telling people, I'm so sorry, I was sick. I can't get you any of these supplies because I didn't know that you needed them by this date. I had the smallpox.
Oh.
All right, shall we roll again?
One more time.
All right, let's go.
Food.
Always with the food. The soldiers are always hungry.
Shelter.
All right, Stephen.
All right. If we had got our full allowance regularly, what was it? A bare pound of fresh beef and a bare pound of bread or flour. The beef, when it had gone through all of its divisions and subdivisions, would not be much over 3/4 of a pound, and that nearly or quite half bones. The beef that we got in the Army was, generally, not many degrees above carrion. It was much like the old Negro's rabbit. It had not much fat upon it, and but a very little lean.
That doesn't sound like very fun to eat. It sounds like some pretty bad meat to eat. Ugh.
But George
Well-
Mason sent some shelter, so it'll help from this rainy day, right?
Exactly. So George Mason is very pleased to note that we have the opportunity to fit out 3 armed cruisers and 2 row galleys for the protection of the Potomac River. So we have, in consequence thereof, bought 3 sloops, the largest of which, called the American Congress, will mount 14 carriage guns and 6 and 4 pounders and be manned by about 90 men. So this is both military equipment and shelter, because of course, members of the Army and members of the American Navy did end up spending time on ships during the American Revolution. Although this is probably not quite the shelter that y'all are looking for out there on a foggy, rainy day today, unfortunately.
Well, that's okay. At least we're getting supplies.
Absolutely. All right, so I'm looking at the time and we are rounding out the end of our time. So I say we do one more roll, but before we do that roll, I do just want to put out there, if anyone has any thoughts or questions that they'd like for us to answer for them, feel free to type them in the chat, in the comments, and we will answer them as best we can live before we close out for the day. All right, are you ready for our last roll, Felicia?
Do it.
Okay, here it goes. Let's see if we can make it match. All right, number 3 is what for you guys?
Shelter.
Shelter.
Oh no!
Uh-oh.
I rolled food.
Oh, finally food. Oh no.
We've been waiting for the food. We're hungry.
I know. Tell me about it.
Well, we'll tell you about shelter. How many times have I had to lie down like a dumb animal in the field and bear the pelting of the pitiless storm? Cruel enough in warm weather, but how much more so in the heart of winter? Could I have had the benefit of a little fire, it would have been deemed a luxury. But when snow or rain would fall so heavy that it was impossible to keep a spark of fire alive, to have to weather out a long, wet, cold, tedious night in the depth of winter with scarcely clothes enough to keep one from freezing instantly. How discouraging it must be.
I'm trying to stay warm.
We'll get you some more blankets, Leanne. We'll work on it. But at the moment,
That was so
Oop.
great.
at the moment we've got food, and I am very excited to say that George Mason sold to the Army 138 pounds of bacon.
Wow!
Yay, bacon.
Yay for bacon!
What the officers ate it all.
The officers probably did eat it all.
So we've got a question. We've got a couple of questions coming in. Our
Okay.
first one is, was there a lot of price gouging?
Oh.
Yes, price gouging is definitely going to be a challenge, and it comes from a lot of things. Part of it is that problem with money not being, backed by gold and silver. So driving inflation that way. Also, competition is going to drive inflation. So there's a lot going on. I think one of the good examples we actually have here in the camp of Washington addressing that is over at our women's area. We show laundry services that the women would be providing for the Army. And over there, we show the prices. So that's an instance where Washington steps in and sets the prices for laundry so that the women in the camp that are doing work aren't gouging the officers and in exchange, the officers aren't shorting them. So there's inflation and there's price gouging within the Army and also outside of the Army when they're trying to, barter with civilians as well. So there's definitely some instances of that. And you'll find in, some of these private merchants, if you will, you'll see them come up frequently. And that kind of tells you that at some point they must have been, found to maybe be a little bit of a more reliable source. So I think the blanket is a good example of getting gouged. You pay for blankets that are half the size they're supposed to be. Really, you only got half your order of blankets. So Captain Armstrong, North Carolina, definitely got into some trouble with that.
Yeah.
And we know that George Mason on our end here at Gunston Hall was part and parcel of writing a bill for procuring a supply of provisions for the Army. And he lists out as a part of this bill, sorry, give me just a second. Sorry about that. He lists out specific prices for a variety of goods. For pickled beef, 24 shillings per pound. For salted pork, 30 shillings per pound, and so on, listing out in an exhaustible list all of this documentation. Sorry, I've got a frog in my throat. Give me just 1 second.
Oh.
All right. Our next question: was George Mason acting in a civilian capacity, or was he afforded a military rank? Yes and no. George Mason is listed in documentation in the 18th century by a variety of military ranks. And by the time of the American Revolution, he was afforded the rank of colonel. So he is listed in a variety of documents as Colonel Mason. From everything that I have learned, he never fought in any military campaign. He served in this function of providing goods to the Army and was recognized as a specific source of goods. But he was in large part acting in a civilian capacity. Well, I think that caps out our questions for today. If anybody has any questions, do feel free to type them into the comments of this video, and we will do our best over the next couple of days to answer them for you. In the meantime, I want to say thank you to everybody who has joined us on Facebook today. We hope you enjoyed this program. And I want to turn it over to the folks at Jamestown-Yorktown to let us know about any upcoming programs that they have going on down there.
Yes. So we have one big one to talk about, and that is coming up November 27th and 28th. It's our annual Foods and Feast of Colonial Virginia. So join us for this Thanksgiving holiday to explore centuries-old culinary practices and cooking techniques from the 17th and 18th century during this two-day event. We hope to see you all there. It's a lot of fun for this event. There's a lot of good food getting cooked in all sorts of places. So that's at Jamestown Settlement and the American Revolution Museum at Yorktown here. So,
and maybe we could the fine things Mr. Mason would have been providing for the Army.
like that bacon.
That sounds so awesome.
I will make sure we cook bacon in honor of Mr. Mason over Foods and
Sounds
Feast.
good. I'm excited about it. So here at Gunston Hall, our next event is next Wednesday at 11 a.m. It is our very first episode of Collecting Rights. We are partnering with the Library of Virginia to get a look at a document in their collection. It's a copy of the Virginia Declaration of Rights that George Mason wrote down in 1778 with some annotations for a friend a couple of years after the original writing of the document. I'm really excited for this deep look into this document. And then save the date for December 15th for Bill of Rights Day. We are working on a partnership program with the Chesapeake Bay Foundation. More to come about that program in the next couple of weeks. Thank you everyone so much for joining us today as well. Thank you to the team at Jamestown-Yorktown Foundation. It's been an amazing amount of fun. Wouldn't be able to do programs like this one without support from you. You are invited to give whatever you can to the Jamestown-Yorktown Foundation or to us here at Gunston Hall to help support our programs, our daily operations, and all of the other wonderful things that we are able to do for you and make virtual programming, and when we're able, in-person programming come to life for you. Thank you so much for joining us today, and we hope you have a great rest of your day. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.